Welcome all. This webinar is an expert level 300 webinar. So I will skip the explanation about what MVC means. I will also not show the fancy diagrams about the MVC architecture. And I will skip the introduction about the Razor view engine and how DevExpress extensions are used in Razor. In case you do want to get familiar with any of the above, my colleague Paul Usher did an excellent webinar on getting started with MVC and the DevExpress MVC extensions, which is available on YouTube. What will I show in this webinar? I will show you how to convert, rebuild an MVC version of the ExpressMe block tool. The ExpressMe block tool is a WebForms based responsive application I've built in 3 previous webinars. These webinars cover things like database design, responsive CSS, JavaScript and DevExpress controls, which I will also not cover in detail. You can watch these webinars on our YouTube channel at the following locations. Because of the architectural differences between WebForms and MVC, there are some smaller parts we can reuse. But before we even start, let me give you a quick tour on the ExpressMe WebForms version, so you will get an impression on what needs to be done. Here we see the homepage of the block tool, and it will show a list of block items, and we will do some loading on demand. You can click on any of these items to view its details, and you can also click back by clicking the logo. Furthermore, we've done some responsive stuff in this tool, and if you click on one of the groups, you'll get a list ordered by group. Another thing is, if you want to add a new blog post, I can click the plus sign, which will bring up a pop-up where we can enter the details of a new blog item. When I go to the details of an existing blog post, I can click the hash sign inside the menu, where I will be able to change the details of this selected post. As you can see, there is some JavaScript involved which does callbacks, etc., and the post is already updated through a callback. So functionality wise, you have an understanding of what needs to be built. Let's check the homepage and see what elements are on there and what kind of controls are used for that. We first have a callback panel, and inside that callback panel there is a menu. The reason that I've put this menu inside the callback panel is that we are able to update the menu without doing a full reload of the page. The listing of the blog posts is done through a data view. And finally, we've got the cloud control on the right side of the page, which will display the tags which are attached to the blogs. Whenever we click the plus or the hash sign, you'll see a pop-up, and the pop-up is being produced by the pop-up control, and inside the pop-up control there is a form layout control which will align several DevExpress editors inside this pop-up. Since these controls are all WebForms controls, they cannot be used in the MVC version because of the different rendering mechanisms between the 2 platforms. Fortunately, this is not a problem, because the DevExpress MVC extensions cover all the controls we need except for one, the cloud control. Since there is no demand for it, it doesn't have an MVC extension, so we will leave this one out. Before we start with the project, let's also take a quick look at the persistent objects data model to see how the data is stored. Besides the HTML, this is one other thing which we will reuse. Our main entity is the XPO post class. It holds the information of one post like title and text. The XPO post class has a relationship with the XPO group. so we can order posts into groups. These groups are also used to populate the top menu of the site. Then there is the class XPO tag, which has a many-to-many relationship with the XPO post class, so we can assign tags to posts. Because of the time of this webinar, we will not cover this functionality. Last, there is the class XPO post attachment. It is used to store the images attached to a post. Again, because of the time, we will not be covering this functionality in this webinar. All these classes are derived from the XPO base item, which means that they have the fields defined in that class as well. I will now add a new project to the existing WebForms solution. The reason for this is because I'm going to reuse the expressme.data assembly as well as the expressme.shared assembly in the MVC version. I will also reuse the plain HTML, JavaScript and CSS because I want to show you the MVC version in the same look and feel as the WebForms version. By adding the MVC project to the solution, it makes things easier, like referencing assemblies, copy over assets, and open the master page and the layout razor file side by side to copy over the HTML. Let's add a new MVC project to this solution by using the DevExpress template gallery. We give it a name. And I will give it the name ExpressMe MVC. Now you will see the DevExpress template gallery. Let me first select the platform we're going to use, which is ASP.NET. Make sure that the language is set to Visual C#, and I will now select the ASP.NET MVC empty web application. I'll give it the same name and click Create Project. The project creation takes some time, so let me explain some differences between the WebForms project and the architecture I'm going to build for the MVC version. In the WebForms project, we have a master page and a content page where in the code behind of these files the controls are being populated by querying the persistent objects immediately. In the MVC project, we will not have such a thing as code behind, and the razor views are strictly for formatting and we can only bind a model to it. For this reason, the MVC controller will query the persistent objects model, where the result is a view model object. This view model object will be bound to the requested view. This view model class has no knowledge about the persistent objects data layer because I will use a lightweight DTO classes in this view model. These DTO classes represent parts of the XPO entities. This approach allows me to precisely define which data I need for certain actions to reduce database calls. I will set up a small reusable class hierarchy for this, and you will see that because of this approach, the actual implementation code is quite small. After the MVC project has been created, I'm going to reference the ExpressMe data project as well as the ExpressMe shared project to the MVC project. The ExpressMe data holds the persistent object classes, and the ExpressMe shared holds the generic initialization code to initialize the persistent object data layer, which is perfectly described in the documentation of XPO. Let's build the project to see that everything can be resolved. In some configurations, it is necessary to manually add the system.web.mvc reference, and that is also the case in my solution. The reason for this is that on some machines a security patch has been installed, and for this I need to select the assemblies, and I can search it up here again, and you'll see that I have the 4.0.0.1 and our project gallery is depending on 4.0.0.0. Fortunately this is pretty quick resolved, and let me see that the project builds. Everything builds, and because it is an empty project, nothing will show if we run. So let's add a home controller, which is the default controller which will be executed when accessing the home page. Also, let's add a view which will be used with this controller, so we will have an actual home page. This is done by expanding the views folder. I'm going to create a new folder which is called home. This corresponds with the home part of the controller that I created earlier, and I'm going to create a new view which is called index. It's going to be a razor file, and I'm going to use the layout or master page. So now if I will run this project, let me make it a startup project as well. We'll have a running MVC application. Well, it doesn't look like the Express Me application, so let's head back to Visual Studio, and now it's time to copy over a number of assets which are in the images folder. So I will just copy that one over to the MVC one. I will also copy over the style sheets folder which holds all the design. And I will copy over one JavaScript file, which is located in the scripts folder. You'll notice that in the MVC version there are a couple of additional scripts included in the project creation, so that's why I'm not going to copy over the jQuery files. There's a scripts folder here as well, and I can just paste it in. This express.me.js file, let me clarify that a bit. It holds all the client-side events of the WebForms controls, and you'll see that these events can be reused in the MVC extensions, but we will get to that a bit later. Now we can start copying over the static HTML which is in the master page, and we can copy that over to the layout razor file. Let me open up the razor file as well. As you can see, it is quite empty. The only things which are in there are a couple of DevExpress helper methods which links in the required style sheets for all the DevExpress extensions, and it will also render in the scripts which are needed for the extensions. This is not done in the WebForms version because that is handled in a different way, and that is possible because of the different architecture. So if I put these two together side by side, we can just merge over most of it. We will not do the assembly registration, we will not do the master page directive, we will also leave out the run at server, and for the rest it is more or less exactly the same. So once we copy that over, we'll have a page which will look like this. Let me put it side by side again. You'll see that I've removed all the run at server portions, and I've removed all the ASP server controls like these ones because they don't exist anymore. What I've also changed is I have put the scripts in the body and removed them out of the head because it's on a production environment, it renders a bit quicker. but that's a completely different story. As you can see, I have also put in the controls, but I've commented them out. So I will have them as a reference in this file, and in the end we will just remove it. And again, yeah, that's just basically the same. The only thing which is pretty important, if you go down into the master page, you will have the content placeholder, which will hold the content of the page, which will be merged inside the master page. This is done in Razor by calling the render body method. So I have just replaced that with the render body part. If I now switch back to my index, you'll see that the index is pretty empty. Let me move this over to this side, because I'm gonna get the default page at the other side. And I will just copy over the static HTML as well. I will remove this index text and replace it. Let me also comment out these controls. And now we should have an MVC version with the global look and feel of the ExpressMe WebForms one. Let me quickly build it and run it again. I can close this one, and as you can see, we will now have something which looks a bit like the WebForms part, which was here. Before we can continue with the presentation layer, we need to start coding the class hierarchy I described earlier. I will start with the DTO classes. The DTO classes, where DTO stands for Data Transformation Object, are lightweight representations of the XPO classes and will be used in the controller and the view model classes. They can be instantiated fast and can be assigned from and to their XPO counterpart. Let's start by setting up a generic DTO base class which can be used across different projects, so I will put it in the ExpressMe shared assembly. I'll create a folder which I will be naming MVC, so we know that this stuff is related to MVC. I'll now create a new class, and this class is going to be called XPO base DTO model. Let me put this one over in this side and close down these ones, so we've got a bit of more space on our screen. And this class is, as said, it's going to be an abstract generic class. I will put in some code and explain what it does. As you can see, I have made it abstract. And I have called this the XPO based DTO model. It's got two generic types which needs to be specified, which is the XPO class, which is the persistent data object, and the key type of the persistent object. Some of us like to use integers as primary keys, other ones like to use quits as primary keys, and that's the reason why I made this generic as well. Let me quickly resolve a number of things here and go further. We've got a default constructor which doesn't have any parameters. I'll also create another constructor which will have one parameter, which is the model it should assign its data to or from. As you can see, the ID field is a virtual and it's specified with a T key type, so that will be strongly typed once we are deriving from this class. Furthermore, I've got two abstract methods which are the assign to and the assign from. And again, because it was generic, these models will be strongly typed once we specify an actual type in the derived class. As I mentioned, I will create two other base classes. One in case you want to use integers as primary key, so I will create this one and I will specify the second, the tkeep type generic, already in there. So if you are using this in your own projects, you can use this class in case you are using primary keys which are integers. Let me also include another one, and that is the one that we are going to use, and that will be one with a GUID as primary key, because that was what I chose when I created the data model. It's gonna look similar as the integer one, except that I have specified GUID for the primary key type. Now we can go to the MVC project and do some actual implementation. I will go to the models folder and I will create a base model. I have decided in this situation that I will hold on to the same model as the persistent objects in this case. But I mean, if you are using a really big data model, and it might be better to separate some things. But in this case, this will work fine because it's only a small database model and it can be done with this approach. This base model is going to have one generic type specified in its declaration. Let me paste this and explain what it does. As you can see, I'm using the created GUID base class, and it will leave the generic type generic. So this means that you can derive a class where you will assign this generic one. Let me also resolve this one, because what I've done in the base class, I had restricted the XPO type to be one of the base classes of persistent objects, but because we are now implementing that code, this can be restricted to the XPO base item, and if I switch back to the model, that will be this, and this will work fine for us because all the other entities are derived from this one, so this will work just fine. As you can see, I've added a number of properties here, which are the add stamp, add IP, add user, and the mod fields as well, and they are exactly the same as the ones in the XPO base item. Furthermore, I have implemented the assign to and the assign from methods, and as you can see, the implementation is quite simple. It will just copy over the properties from the model to this object, or vice versa, depending on the assign from and the assign to. This is just the other way around. With this done, we can now start creating the post model, which will be the representation. If I switch back to the XPO diagram, I will now implement this post model class. And this can be done by going back to the models, create a new class, which is going to be called post model. This class will be derived from base model, and here I will tell that I am dealing with XPO post objects. I will obviously need to resolve this, and what we can do now is to make things a bit quicker. I will paste in some code and explain what it does right after. So first we have the post model, which implements the XPO post as a generic type. You'll see that the constructor will be strongly typed by now. I have also implemented an isCompact property, which I will talk about a bit later. And as you can see, I have the title, active, article, I've got a group title, etc., etc., which is similar to the fields which are specified right here. The only thing which is worth noticing is that the group is in this case of the type GUID. So in other words, I'm storing the key value of the specified group, while in the XPO model this will be of the type XPO group. If I check the properties, you'll see that it is of type XPO group. So because of that, we will need to do a tiny bit of conversion, but we can solve that in the assign from and the assign to method. In this case, when I go to the assign from, that means that I will need to set the properties of this object with the properties of the model. And the model will have a property called group ID, which will return a GUID. So this is the first conversion. In the assign to, I will do it the other way around. And in that case, I will have the ID and I have to look up that actual object. Because in this case, if I check this group one, this is an XPO group object. And this can be done by calling the getObjectByKey method, which is provided by persistent objects. So there is a bit of conversion here. What you also notice is that I didn't do anything with the group title. The reason for that is that in the model, if I go to the group title and check its properties, you will see that this is being evaluated by the SQL Server in this case to resolve the group.title. So this is a read-only field, so there is no use of putting that back at runtime, and you will probably get a runtime error when you try doing anyway. So this is our post model. And this is basically, if I switch back to the slide, you'll see that this is the first DTO class that we have implemented right now. You might notice some red lines underneath these IEnumerable models, and that is because we haven't implemented those classes yet. And as you can see, I will just get a list of groups and I get a list of available tags, and I will return that as well. That's also one of the things which is quite convenient with using the DTO approach, because I can bind this property later on to, for instance, a combo box which is bound to the group. But we'll talk about that later. Let me first make use of my CodeRush plugin and say declare this class. And as you can see, CodeRush creates a new file for me and it will just put in that class. That class will obviously be derived from the base model class. And also, for the sake of time, I will paste in some code and explain really quick what it does, because it basically does the same as the post model class. I've specified the generic type. I've got a strongly typed parameter in the constructor, and the fields which are specified here are basically the same as the ones in the model. Furthermore, I have implemented the assign from and the assign to, and because I was calling the base assign to and the base assign from, you'll see that the add fields and the mod fields are being retrieved as well. This does remember that I have to change one thing in that base class, because I remembered that I made a small issue. I created a small issue there. I don't need to change that here, but I have to change it in the base model. In the assign to, I will not update these fields, because there is some logic inside the persistent objects which will deal with this. So I can just comment these out, otherwise nothing is done with it and they will remain empty or whatever. So that is just a small thing that I remembered all of a sudden. So if I go back to the post attachment model, well, everything's fine here. If I go to the post model, we'll see that this one is resolved already. Let me also execute my CodeRush menu and say declare class for the tag model. You will notice that the tag model is a really simple one because it only has a name. So the DTO class is also pretty simple. It only has a name, and I've included the post count, and yeah, this is used for the cloud control, but yeah, there isn't a cloud control, but I will still fill this property. And also the same, this is evaluated on the server, so there is no need doing the vice versa in the assign to method. The last model that we should create is the group model. I'm going to execute code rush menu and hit declare class, and it's already there. The group model is very similar to the tag model because it only has a title. So I can also, without too much explanation, copy in this code, and well, this will make sense to you by now. So now we have done, if I switch back to this little diagram, we have now finished the DTO classes here. Because we have done a bit of coding, let me do a quick build to see that everything is still okay. And yes, it is. Now that the DTO classes are set up, we can continue with the view model classes. Let me switch back to the slideshow to show that we are going to implement the view model class. Also for the view model class, I'm going to set up a base view model, and this base view model is a base class in the project. So there is no need to put it in the shared assembly. Let me close down these ones and let me create a folder to make it a bit more clear, which is going to be called view models. And I will start coding in a class which will be called base view model. Again, I will copy in a bit of code and explain right after what it does. This is going to be an abstract class because I want anybody who is using this this project for its own good to implement a couple of things here. The first two things which are worth mentioning are that I have two abstract booleans which are called menu show insert item and menu show edit item. If I switch back to the WebForms version, on the home page I have a plus. If I go to a group overview page, I won't have anything. I will only have the groups. If I go to any of the detail pages, I will have a hash. So this is needed in every view. So basically in every page we will need to determine that, because I want to bind the menu items to something inside the view model. If I switch back to the slideshow, you'll see that I will create a property which is called menu items, and that can be bound directly to the menu. So let's start with that. As you can see, I have a property which is only returning something. You cannot assign anything to it because there is no need for that, and it is an IEnumerable of DevExpress.web.menuItems. And what I do here is I will create a menu collection and return that in the end, but I will check the menu show insert item to determine if I should add that item. And I will also check the menu show edit item to see if we need to add that edit item as well. For the rest, I will add all the groups which were in the groups property, and a group property is right below, and this is just a simple get set construction because I'm going to set the value of this property in the controller, and that is exactly according to the plan that I've put in here. The same goes for the posts. I'm going to set that in the controller as well because it's depending on the controller which posts should be displayed. Same goes for the tags, but as mentioned, I will code in some stuff for the tags, but in the end I will not do any displaying purposes with it. This ID we will need in a later stage because we need to, when editing one of the items, we need to get that ID from the controller and get it on some other places. But I will put it in and talk about it a bit later. So once this base view model has been set up, I can define a new view model, which I will call home view model. This home view model will be derived from my base view model. And this is something that I really love. I can now say implement the abstract class, and it will only give me two things, which are the show insert item and the show edit item. And in this case, well, it should only have the insert item. So that is being coded by returning true here and returning false there. Let me see, because something is still a bit reddish, which is normally not good, but it is good anyway. So now we have our home view model. I can in a later stage create a post view model which will display the, or will handle the details of a specific post. But what we're gonna do now is we're gonna set up the controller classes. Also the controller, if I switch back to the slideshow, the controller should have some knowledge about persistent objects, because it needs to query them and it needs to do updates, inserts and deletes on those objects. It's all being done through the controller. So it is wise to set up a base controller which will do the actual updates, deletes, inserts, etc. So that also makes sense, putting that controller in the shared assembly, because I'm gonna make it that generic that you can use it in your own projects as well. Let me add a new class, and I'm gonna give it the name XPO base controller. This controller will have just a bit of code. It's not really a lot, so let me get that code and put it in here and explain what it does afterwards. As you can see, I've made it abstract again, and it's got two generic types which needs to be specified when deriving something from this base controller. This base controller is derived from the MVC, the standard MVC controller, and I have restricted the XPO class to be one class derived from at least XPO base object. I have further put in an enum, which I will explain just a bit down the line. And well, I've implemented a constructor, but there is no need for it because apparently it is a protected constructor, so I can just remove it as well. Well, if you are using persistent objects, you will need something which is called a session or a unit of work whenever you're doing selects, updates, inserts, deletes, etc. So I've created a little property which will return a unit of work, which is similar to a transactional kind of thing. So you can do several updates, and in the end you will tell this XPO session commit changes, and it will do it all the physical updates inside the database. This is actually some code which is reused from the WebForms part, which is also in the shared assembly. Well, then I have created a private method which will do a DB action, and a DB action is an insert, an update or a delete, and I like to do that in the same method, so that's why I've created the enumeration. And what this basically does is I will, in case of an insert, I will need to create a new persistent object, which is done by this construct. And if I will do a delete or an update, I will first need to select the item we're going to update or delete. So that is being handled by this statement, which you've seen before on the DTO classes. And once something has been created or has been located, depending on the operation, I will do a delete in case of a delete, and otherwise I will call the assign_to method from the DTO classes which we implemented. If everything has been done, I will commit the transaction by calling the commit changes one on the session, and that will handle all the operations. And I have chosen to create a DB insert with only one parameter, which is the model, and that will call the DB action. So I will only have like one parameter in those methods. Obviously you could also remove these ones and make the other one protected. It's like your personal preference, and I like to do it like this, but if you want to do it any other way, feel free to do so and let me know, obviously. So this is our base controller. I was mentioning the generic. I also made the key type again generic, and that is needed for this XPO base DTO model class. What I've put down below is the same construct that I did for the DTO model. I've also created a base class in case you're working with integer primary keys, and I've created the same one in case you're working with GWT primary keys. And I have specified the second generic type here. We will be dealing with this controller as base controller. Now we can go back to the controller folder in the project, because now we're going to do the actual implementation, and for that I will add another controller which will be the base controller for this actual project. I will call it base controller, and this base controller will be derived from the controller that I just created. And let me put in a bit of code here. This class is going to be replaced with a bit of code which is similar to this. I did remove one of the generic types by creating this base GWT class, but I have introduced a new one to specify the view model. The reason for that is that in the actual home controller a bit later I will have a strongly typed view model. That's the only reason that I created this generic type. Let me resolve a couple of things here. Also, I have limited the XPO class type to be anything which is derived from XPO base object. And the same goes for the base view model. That is something from our application, so it should be at least something which is derived from our base view model. And this will be our base controller class. What I can do now is I can change the home controller and let it be derived from our base controller, where I will specify the generic types. I'm dealing with the posts, and I will be handling the home view model. So this means that we will now have everything configured. If I switch back to the diagram now, the controller, the home controller, knows we are dealing with these persistent objects XPO post, and we are able to update, and we also are able to return the correct view here. So if I go back here, it was an abstract class, so let us implement the abstract class. As you can see, I now have a strongly typed get model. That was the reason that I introduced another generic type. The code in here can be pretty much as simple as the following. I will create a home view model object and use initialization construction for setting the groups, the posts, and the tags. And I will just use plain link queries to get that stuff out of persistent objects, which will get it out of the database. Let me add one namespace which is called DevExpress.xpo. So I will get rid of a couple of red curls, and I will also need to add the models namespace. So this is our get model, and if I now change the default action to I want to return the index and I want to bind the get model to it, you will notice that once we run this and we have configured the appropriate controls, that we have everything we need, so we can actually bind some information to this model. Let's head back to the index.chtml file and do something with the view model which is provided. Well, we have commented out the data view web server control, so let's insert the DevExpress data view MVC extension. This is done by right-clicking inside the code and select insert a DevExpress MVC extension. As you can see, we will have an overview with all our MVC extensions, and by navigating to the data tab, there is the data view already. The data view needs to have an extension name, and I will call it post data view. It will be rendered in a partial view, so that partial view also should have a name, and I will call that post view partial. Next, I can select a model class, and as you can see, we will have all the models resolved here. And I will select the post model because these are the items that we will bind to this data view. And this is going to be one of my DTO classes. So here we are. Then we could also select a data context class, but I will skip that because that is more for the entity framework, which we're not going to use right now. So if we're all set, we can insert this extension. You'll see a couple of things flashing around right now, but the bottom line is that there is an HTML.action method inserted on the place where we would expect the control, and it has an action which points to the post view partial. So if I go to the home folder, you'll notice that the post view partial has been generated here. And what happens is that this data view method from the DevExpress HTML helper methods is called with a configuration object which will eventually render the HTML which is needed for the data view. As you can see, there are a couple of settings already set up here, which are the name, which is specified. There is something called callback route values, which are values which are sent back to the controller when a callback occurs, for instance for page loading or some other AJAX calls. Also the allow paging is set, and if I show this one side by side to the index one, which holds the commented out code of the web server control, you'll see that there are quite a number of properties which are one-on-one the same. If I see it here, for instance, the CSS class, which is also available in the settings configuration object, and so on and so on. The only thing which is slightly different is the item template. In WebForms we can specify some HTML in this template. That doesn't work exactly the same in the MVC extensions. We have to call a method which is called setItemTemplateContent, and the code which is executed here will be done for every item, so it's slightly different. Because we have to set quite a number of properties, I will copy over the properties that we will be dealing with. And to give you an impression on the properties that you saw in the markup of the WebForms part. These are the exact same properties. So I've got a CSS class, endless paging mode, show numeric buttons, rows per page, etc, etc, etc. You'll see a couple of red curls here, and that means because I'm going to use this partial view also on another page later on, I need the controller who is processing this request. One way of getting that controller name is by executing the following code in front of this partial, and this is one way of getting the controller which is currently working. So now you'll see that this has been solved. What I now need to do is I need to set the item template content, and because this is bound to a post model, I'd like to have that inside that method. I'd like to have the current post. So what we can do here is we can just declare something like this, which will get the data item, and instead of using the view context.writer.write to write some content in, I will render in a round panel, because if I switch back to the WebForms part, you'll see that we use a round panel here. So we need to render that inside that item template content. And we can do that by activating the wizard again, but we can also write it out by code, and that is done by something similar. We call the round panel method of the DevExpress helper extension, and I'm going to set some properties which are more or less the same. And the last thing is again the set content, which will render the content of that panel. And I have chosen to create another partial which will do the actual rendering of one of the blog posts. Let me quickly create the article partial, and I will do that just by coding it in. So I'm going to create a new view. It's going to be called article partial, and I'm going to specify that it should be created as a partial view. Let's click add, and the code that will go in there is some actual HTML together with a couple of razor constructs. It will just look like this. I have specified the model directive here, so it's expecting something which is derived from a post model. In the callback route values of this object, I will need a controller which is executing the actual code right now. So I'm going to use the same construct I've used before. And here you will see a nice HTML div which will render in some dynamic properties coming out of this model. And here there is the model article. You notice that I have created an isCompact property on this model. So if I navigate back to the post model, you'll see that in this case it is a read-only property and it's always returning true. The reason for this is that in another page, the detail page of the post, I will use another model which is derived from this post model, and it will return false. So in that case we are able to display the image gallery, which is being written out here as well, in the same way that we have been doing for the other controls. If it is a compact mode, then we would need a link to go to the details, and that's being handled by just doing this. Let me go back to the post view partial. Let me start at the index.html, because the post view partial should have a second parameter in this action method, which is the model that is being passed on to this post view partial, and it's going to be model. But that means that the home view model is being passed on to render this post view partial. So if we go to the post view partial, you might have noticed that the data view is being bind to the model, and that is not correct in this case because we don't want to view the home view model, but we want to view the posts which are inside that model. So I can just change this and add the .post property to it, and now the data view will be bound to this post collection which is in the view model. Once we have set it up all together, we need to check one other thing. Yeah, everything is okay. I can now build the application and run it. And it's now connecting to the database, and now it's giving me an error, and that is because I made a typo. Let me go back to the post view partial. It should be posts, obviously. It is not only one post, but it is a collection of posts. And if I run the application again, you'll see that we have our blog posts. And it's nice if I switch back to the WebForms one, you will see that it has the same order. Before I can do that, let me run that thing again. And you'll see that it has exactly the same posts on the WebForms part and the MVC one. And they also look the same. The last thing I'm going to implement is the menu. And if we switch back to the PowerPoint slide, we'll see that we will need a callback panel extension, and inside the callback panel extension we'll render a menu extension. Let me go to the layout HTML file, because we will render it in there because it's necessary on every page. So on this spot, right where the callback panel comments are, I will right click and insert a DevExpress MVC extension. The callback panel is right on the first tab. I will give this panel a name, which is nav container. Next, it will need a partial view name, and that partial view is going to be called navigation partial. Now I need to select the controller because some code is going to be rendered in that controller, and I'm going to select the home controller. Let me insert this code. So it's going to do a couple of things here, and it has already inserted the navigation partial, and it has specified the controller here. I will just remove this parameter because what I'm going to do also is, if I switch to the home controller, we'll see that the partial view will be rendered in here. But because it is on every page, I can just cut out this code and go to the base controller and paste it in here. And to make things a bit neater, I can change the navigation partial. I can remove the file extension, that's not necessary, and I can remove this path as well. And what we also gonna specify is that it will be bound to the get model dot menu items. So the menu items collection will be passed over to the callback panel. So once that's set up, I can go back to the navigation partial, and you'll see that a couple of things are being rendered in here. The properties that I will be setting are more or less the same as the WebForms counterpart. So that is going to be exactly this. And let me change the panel settings here as well. So it's going to have the name, the callback routes, the width, etc, etc. The other thing that we need to change is the content. And in this case, we're going to render in the menu, and we're going to bind the model which is passed to this partial view to the menu. Well, I will write that out. I will not use the wizard, but I will just paste the code in here, and you'll notice that it is the same as that the wizard has been doing. So I have the HTML DevExpress extension method menu, which will nicely render the menu with the settings that are exactly the same as the settings which are in the WebForms part. I even specify the client-side click event, which will be linked to the JavaScript file that I have moved over. And before I render this menu, I will bind it to the model that was passed to the callback panel, and that will be the collection with menu items. If we now run the application, you will notice that we have the menu in place as well. Here are all the groups. Obviously nothing is going to happen right now because we haven't done anything on a group controller, and also the plus is not going to work because we didn't do anything with the pop-up extension and all the code which is involved on that particular part. But this is the end of the first part of this MVC project. So I hope that you have learned a lot out of it, and please check out my next webinar where I will implement the pop-up, where I will do the updates and the edits on the posts, and I will make the entire application work. Thank you for watching.